Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Director of the Global Perspectives Office. Our guest today is Dr. Shubhro Sen, who has been called the entrepreneur's entrepreneur and is one of the deep thinkers of our time on global issues, including the outsourcing question. Welcome, Dr. Sen.
Thank you, John. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your perspective toward the world in the 21st century. What are the focal countries? What are the focal issues? What are your concerns? What are your optimistic perspectives?
Well, that's a wonderful broad question to start with. Well, I do think that the 21st century is a century of new opportunity. One would have not thought that countless new fortunes are going to be made in new industries, some of which we haven't even fully defined as yet. There are going to be new actors on the global stage, most notably India and China, but I would imagine followed not far behind by Brazil and Russia, and possibly if there's a country that emerges from Africa, could be South Africa or even Nigeria. So we are going to see a subtle, if not even more overt shift in the world order that'll be manifest both politically, certainly economically, and increasingly we're seeing it also spread into the sociocultural and sporting realms. So in that sense, I believe it's a century of wild opportunity and excitement and much to look forward to.
On the downside, what are your main concerns?
My biggest concerns are that there is, with the shift in power or the steady erosion of a base of power for certain countries, notably the Western countries, possibly in favor of the emerging countries of Asia. There could be a hardening of attitudes, especially to global immigration and other issues in the established countries. There could also be disaffection because of loss of jobs. As we know, the outsourcing phenomenon is well upon us, and more things are being outsourced, which do cause short-term dislocation and impact. So there could be at one level disaffection and discontent in areas that have traditionally been strong. There could also be really a coming of age and coping issues in countries such as China and India, which are in differing ways not fully prepared to assume the mantle of global power. So I think what we're likely to see in the next 2 decades is a transitional period where the actors jockey for position. But I think the net result is going to be, as has become popular to allude to, a flatter world, a world in which there's greater cooperation, a world in which there's great interchange, where there's a cross-fertilization of ideas across societies and often interdisciplinary stuff across industry. So in that sense, I think we're going to see unprecedented new levels of cooperation in the world, and hopefully that comes with peace. I think with great trade and great business and an expansion of consumer credit, among other things, you're much more likely to see a more homogenized, peaceful world order. So
let's talk about the outsourcing phenomenon for a moment. This is a word that seems to engender a lot of discontent, a lot of suspicion in many audiences, and maybe if you could distinguish between outsourcing and offshore outsourcing so that we understand exactly what we're talking about.
Yes. No, I think that's a very good question. Outsourcing is endemic to corporations. By definition, our model is based on functional specialization. And if there are certain things we don't do well at scale, historically, we've outsourced them. I mean, it's starting with lawyers and advertising and HR and accounting services and things that we're very familiar with outsourcing here. And even today, it's important to note that 80% of outsourcing in the US is domestic. It's outsourced to other domestic entities. Now, it just so happens those domestic entities are increasingly being owned by foreign outsourcers. That's a new phenomenon. But nevertheless, 80% of the outsourcing is being done domestically. So offshore outsourcing is still a relatively small proportion. One of the statistics that's much ballyhooed is the loss of jobs. If I were to look at statistics regarding the actual loss of jobs attributable to outsourcing in technology, which is one of the more visible areas. The estimated number is about 300,000 jobs over the last 5 to 7 years. That's in a good month. Now, admittedly, they're not being added at the same level, but in a good month, that's as many jobs as the US economy adds in 1 month. So, in reality, is it time to beat our breast and be unduly concerned about offshore outsourcing? No. But is all outsourcing alike? No. Equally, I believe a number of outsourcing decisions made by US firms have been myopic and have proved to be myopic with sort of hindsight, that it perhaps may have been better, instead of moving the sneaker factory to Korea 20 years ago, to move it to Mississippi or Alabama or to other parts of the country that potentially are less developed. Because what happened was, with that outsourcing, wages rose in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Thailand, and some of the Asian tigers. And so over time, the factor price equalization was such that there was really no big advantage. We could well have just sent it to Mississippi or to South Carolina, and today we may have had a different level of development in Louisiana, in some of these states which have some senses suffered and have been, really stepsisters and, as part of the global picture. So not all outsourcing is, I think, well conceived or really fully thought through. In other industries, there simply aren't any resources. So what does the corporation do if it has to meet global competitive goals? So in those cases, you really have to bite the bullet, go where the efficiency is, go where the productivity is, and look to the fallout positive multiplier that affects outsourcing. It's important to understand that every time outsourcing takes place and we, in a sense, export jobs, well-paying jobs, skilled jobs to developing countries, the purchasing power that now those workers are now left with, typically about half of that or more is going to American goods. They're buying American computers, they're buying consumer products, they're consuming American shows, they're taking holidays overseas, they're doing all kinds of things that are in some way or the other working back. So it's not just a univariate flow. Typically, even with those types of outsourcing, there's a good quid pro quo. So again, with everything, it's important to look into the details of the specific context, the specific industry, its labor utilization, the resource needs, and then reach a judgment whether it's damaging or not. But there's no question that it's a phenomenon that's here, and it's one that we have to cope with, and that one that we have to plan to, in a sense, take advantage of.
You mentioned India and China. When you go back in time about a generation, did you anticipate the rise of China in the way it has taken form? And second, did you anticipate a similar astonishing rise on the part of India?
That's actually a good question. Yes, I would say yes. Certainly I grew up, in the 60s in India, and my generation was, fully ready to compete globally, and we fully expected good things of it. Now, did the circumstances exist in the manner that they have unfolded? No. So really the traditional model was that you go out to the US or the UK or Canada and you get the best education possible, you rise as rapidly as you can through the hierarchy there, and then you contribute in a trickle-down manner. What the internet did and what the computing revolution did was that it created such fabulous wealth for certain entrepreneurs in such a short time that they became visible symbols, both in India and in China, of progress and success for the generation to come. And even as I say that my generation, the 60s, was ready to compete, the next generation actually has emerged with a sense of global entitlement. They believe they belong. Which was different. We were more diffident. We hoped to belong. This generation knows it belongs, and it can point to any number of examples. As I think we were talking about earlier today, the richest man in the world is now Indian. And is that critical? Yes and no. Yes, to the degree that it's going to inspire countless others, because the story of this particular fortune is a startling Horatio Alger type story. His father was literally sold washing powder detergent to the poor people of Western India, and he amassed a fortune and built a conglomerate that has now been split in half. And half of it has led to one of them becoming the richest man in the world, and this has happened in the last 20 years. So the impact of such examples, I think, is profound. And there's not just one. I mean, there's, if you look at the Forbes billionaire list, the largest number of new entrants are from India and China. So I think the visible example of wealth and success, and also in other fields of endeavor, has served to inspire the next generations in India and China. So the long answer to your question is yes, it was expected or anticipated, hoped for, but I think it's happened faster and come sooner than anyone might have thought.
Now, in the case of China, do you think it has the capability to continue the current level of success, the double-digit or close to double-digit annual growth it's experienced for the past many years? Is it capable of continuing that into the future? And must it, in fact, continue that level of success so that you create more haves in the system who were have-nots, and you contribute to the stability and legitimacy of the ruling party? Is that essential, or do you think there's some wiggle room?
I think China is going to continue to grow just because the sheer mass of people involved and the sheer impetus that they have in a number of industries. Nevertheless, China faces, I think, serious social and political problems into the future unless it can find a magic way to bring in the disenfranchised rural Chinese population into the fold. The Chinese Revolution, as we understand it today, is really restricted to the coasts. It's as if New England and the Atlantic coast and California were enriched and the rest of the country was left behind. Now, how long will the rest of the country tolerate this situation? We're increasingly hearing reports that they're getting very restive. There are innumerable riots occurring in Chinese towns, small towns especially, against corrupt party officials that don't even get reported in the Chinese press, let alone the world press. How long will this continue? Will the resentment sort of simmer over the top? So to me, that's the key question. If China can somehow find a way to bridge this, can build pockets of prosperity in sort of central China and rural China, and the same is, by the way, true for India as well. India has fewer challenges just because there's no cap on that bottle. You know, people can at least let their resentments be known and find some recourse, and at least they can argue about it and feel marginally satisfied. In China's case, it's far more driven by fiat. The villagers are literally locked into their villages. They can only go into towns if they're indentured to some business, and then they are mistreated like migrant labor in those villages, and in those towns, and they enjoy lower rights, and they don't own land, they don't have the right to own land, they don't have any social mobility except in small instances. So I think that's a serious issue for China and the Chinese leadership to confront, and to the extent that they're able to overcome it, yes, we're going to see healthy growth rates. Even a 5 to 6% growth rate for a Chinese-style GDP in another 5 years is going to be significant. When the U.S. grows at 4% at its current rate, that's an amazing year. So I expect China to continue its progress, but not without some hiccups. And it's possible that those hiccups could be violent.
What about in India? What's your forecast for its situation?
India faces different pressures, which could potentially end up in the same thing. There are pressures within India for different states to go their own way. And there are different reasons for that. Firstly, India was never a country. India was like Europe. It united to expel the British. And through the constitution and the efforts of the first Home Minister of India, who was really a very powerful man in Indian history, he, in a sense, forced the constitution on 500 kingdoms. He basically gave them 48 hours after independence to sign, or the then Indian Army would be at their door to annex them, in effect. Only one state resisted, and that was the Nizam of Hyderabad. At that time, he was the third richest man in the world, and so he was literally annexed and brought into the Indian fold. So there was some strong arm tactics employed to forge India, but I think the manner in which it was forged led India to create some unity. Over time, the socialist model that India had inherited created a great deal of resentment in different parts of the country. There were linguistic issues. The Hindi-speaking bloc was dominating the country, so those who didn't speak Hindi as their first language, who preferred to speak English, which is why English de facto became the national language, because people would rather speak English than the dominant Hindi bloc's language, especially in the south of India. So those pressures mounted. The other pressure that mounted is when you had a corrupt central government, which was basically siphoning off tax revenues, and very little was flowing down to the states, and the states felt that there was really no percolation of the wealth, and they were not. So they said, why don't we do this on our own? Who needs the central government? Now that feeling is still alive in a number of the states. We saw sort of rebellions in Northeast India. We've seen rebellions in Northwest India, one of the most prosperous states. India's version of California, Punjab, saw that. So there were a lot of issues in those states. So India could well fracture. One of the things that I like to mention in my presentation is that we may well see a federal version of the United States of India in another 10 to 15 years if there's no compelling logic that continues to bind the people together. So India, I think, has fewer problems than China in this regard, but it's not that it does not have the problems. It too faces the same issue, that the Indian Revolution is excluded so far a good 600-700 million people who are earning $2 to $3 a day, and while they are, they are mobile, they can go find jobs anywhere, and they are increasingly flying to the cities. It's not something that India can take blithely and say that yes, we're on our way. I think India needs serious changes in the way land is owned. Land reform is a big political hot potato in India, and until we have real land reform, we're not going to be able to bring these 600 million people into the national fold. And until we do that, that's going to be kind of like the sword of Damocles hanging over India as well.
Talk a little bit about your own interests. What's it like to be an entrepreneur in the 21st century versus 20th century? Many more opportunities, sky's the limit? Or has it always been that way for you?
Yes, I think the late 20th century was not dissimilar. I think the 21st century is different only to the extent that there's just more and more new industries that we frankly just, perhaps didn't know enough, or I didn't know enough to fathom that they could, nanotechnology or superconductivity. If you remember, 15 years ago, superconductivity came out. By 2010, we're supposed to see the first benefits of superconductivity, and I believe the implications are profound, So yes, the 21st century is amazing. The world is your oyster, and you've got a broad palette to paint on. There's a lot more money available from a lot more sources. So as an entrepreneur, it's really great because this is the time where the primacy of ideas and the highlighting of creativity is greater than it's ever been. And so for those who have good ideas, those who are creative about how they assemble those and color those ideas and bring them to market, there's never been a better time. So in that sense, I'm delighted not only to continue my entrepreneurial activities, but to increasingly invest in companies, sponsor them, educate new entrepreneurs, do all the little things that one can do to have fun with this.
Where do your interests take you these days? Are you still mostly focused on the IT sector, or are your interests more diverse?
Well, I've actually broadened out. Some of it is client-led. Some of my consulting customers have, in a sense, led me into new industries, and one of them is the mobile. I'm getting to participate in the mobile revolution in Asia. I mean, just to give you a sense, Asia will have by next year 61% of the mobile users in the world. So that's really 60% of the market. And if you look at trends in the market as to the types of services we're going to get from our mobile phone, it's actually one of the most exciting things around. The phone instrument itself is actually now the least interesting part of the business. That's been commoditized. And there are relatively few oligopolistic type of structures. There are a few firms that are able to do it, but they're really not making that much money from the instrument. Where you're making the money is from the data, which is the messaging traffic that's going on, and on the content, what people are actually doing on the phone, what they're consuming, videos, music. I mean, ringtones are a $4 billion global industry for, I mean, who could have predicted that, 5 years ago? So the next generation of mobile services is now what are called personal services, where your phone will be replacing your credit card. You won't need your credit card anymore because you'll have a code in it. Merchants will have barcodes. Your phone will just simply recognize the barcode that will link to your account, and the transaction is done. So there's all kinds of interesting forms of disintermediation coming with the mobile phone. So that's been one of the most exciting things I've done in the last year. And I'm really driving the market entry strategies for several firms into Asia Pacific, which, as I mentioned, is the largest mobile markets in the world. So that's been very exciting. And that in turn has opened out all kinds of new opportunities. One last technology to mention is something called WiMAX. WiMAX is a kind of a constrained wireless broadband, which you can do with relatively lower investments in equipment and towers. And so in that sense, from a long-term perspective, the WiMAX standard could well be one that takes root in the emerging countries, where countries that we couldn't imagine will suddenly have wireless broadband, which is a very big, very big factor in actually progressing industry across sectors. So if you were to again ask me to distill what is the most exciting thing I've been doing, it's really beyond outsourcing. It's been the mobile revolution. And of course, there's outsourcing within that. All the really effective carriers are splicing their services and outsourcing everything that they can, and are really focusing on the customer interface.
If someone in the United States is interested in maximizing his or her international opportunities, where would you send them? To India, to China, to both, other parts of the world? Where do they need to be?
Well, I think it depends to some degree where they are in the U.S. I think if we were to think of Florida in particular, I think Florida cannot ignore the Americas, and especially South America. I think it remains a huge, huge opportunity. So learning the cultures and languages of South America, notably Brazil, where Portuguese could be. Brazil, I believe, will become a major trading partner for the U.S. Has not really received its due, and even from the U.S. And I think it's girding up to compete with India and the others. So certainly, I would not ignore the hinterland, as it were, Central and South America. There's fantastic opportunities there. The other obvious opportunities are India and China. And the way to do it would be to take on internships with Indian companies. There are job opportunities there, Chinese companies, to potentially learn the language. Learning the language obviously is a huge, huge plus. In India, you still can really do well with English, so there's really no added learning to do, so it's better in the Indian case to plunge right in. In the Chinese instance, clearly there are linguistic barriers, there are also associated cultural barriers, so I think learning the language would be a great first step to engaging with those countries. But certainly, if I were to look at, those would be the three biggest regions, followed by Russia and Eastern Europe. Those are also extremely vibrant places. Russia has a bit of a law and order issue right now, non-trivial, especially for foreigners, but nevertheless, Eastern Europe is booming.
Eastern Europe is booming. Back at the end of the Cold War, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was the expectation that a democratized Russia would bring all kinds of economic opportunities, assuming that the economic model they were pursuing continued to unfold. And we've had some setbacks, some say politically as well as economically, and it seems that those who have benefited in Russia are a relatively small percentage of the population, much smaller than the percentages that you, even relative to their much bigger populations in India and China.
Yes, no, I think that that has been an issue partly relating to the Russian political and economic structure, because those who got the opportunity to become wealthy did so via access, in some way or the other, some sort of privileged access. It wasn't, democratized in the sense that anybody could aspire to reach those positions. The other thing that happened is that a lot of the initial Russian wealth, especially in IT, migrated quickly to the former Eastern Europe. So it was Poland and the Czech Republic and Hungary, Estonia, some of these areas that benefited as much from the Western influences, because often they found it easier, even the established Russian firms found it easier to operate and interact with the West from locations outside of Russia. So I think that's part of the reason why really the prosperity boom has not devolved as far down into Russian society as perhaps it could have. But nevertheless, it remains so well endowed with natural resources and such a good basic education system that one cannot but assume that Russia is going to have a seat at the prime table, in world affairs for the next, decades to come. And to that extent, there's going to be tremendous business opportunity there. And to that extent, again, U.S. firms will find, and U.S. students and the youth of the U.S. will find opportunity there.
Thank you, Dr. Sen, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, John.
Great. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia. We'll see you next time.